This is a very brief video presentation of research on how economies of prestige are embedded in artist relationships to subject matter, participants, and institutions. It is first important to describe the context in which artists operate. Neoliberalism, the dominant political and economic ideology of our time, developed from the political philosophy of classical liberalism, which placed a particular anthropology of man as an economic subject at the center of politics. Neoliberalism extends this process of making economic activity a general matrix of social and political relations, but takes as its focus not exchange, but competition. All activities through which we attempt to realize our ends, all social action, even relationships, can now be understood through exchanges of capital. The terms of opposition between worker and capitalist are scrambled. The worker becomes a self-disciplined capitalist, exploiting their own human capital. Two key instruments which transmit this worldview to artists are the commercial art market and art education. In the commercial art market, an artwork's increasing capacity to function as a tradable investment brings into a closer and closer relation its artistic value and its price. In the pricing of artworks, exchange value is tied above all to aesthetic judgment. The high visibility of this valuation helps transmit this logic to artists and, of course, to the educational institutions in which they develop their practice and advance their careers. Educational institutions across Europe are in the process of adapting to the neoliberal agenda, and art institutions are no different. In the case of the Netherlands, it can be said that most of the current academies and universities follow the dominant agendas of their funders. The fact of the matter is, in many cases, art educational institutes influenced by governmental funding bodies and the commercial art market are functioning to promote the neoliberal worldview to art students. If artists are entrepreneurs of themselves, what are they selling? To imagine that an artist's work is the only commodity they are trading would be unfortunately simplistic. The artists themselves, represented by their work, are commodities. This was recently highlighted by the street artist Banksy's work in Central Park. His work often sells for tens of thousands, but this time he struggled to sell it for pennies. The plain and simple reason is that the consumers did not know if the artwork was original, that is, they did not know if the work was attributable to the artist Banksy. The work, identical to his work sold by galleries, was perceived as close to worthless without a legitimized association to the artist. In one work sold, the misrecognition of the artist decreased its value by 3,750%. Such striking transfers of value from artist to object are not confined to visual art. When world-renowned violinist Joshua Bell, as part of an experiment, busked at a subway in Washington, D.C. with his $4 million violin, he earned $32. Another interesting example of this process is experimental composer John Cage's 433. 433 is 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. It is now on sale on iTunes for 99 cents. What is this value that the artist transfers? In Pierre Bourdieu's terms, it is symbolic capital. In its simplest definition, we can call it prestige. If we think about human capital as described by Foucault, we can conceive of people's attributes, innate and acquired, as forms of immaterial capital with which they enter marketplaces of social and professional relations. Symbolic capital can be understood as a symbolic byproduct that manifests in an individual when these forms of immaterial capital are recognized and legitimated. A familiar form of immaterial capital is social capital, most simply described as the resources made available to an individual on the basis of their social networks. A much more intriguing form is one developed in the 1960s by Bourdieu: cultural capital. Cultural capital appears in three distinct forms. In the embodied state, it appears in forms such as educational standard, accent, manners, dress, and taste. In the objectified state, cultural capital is an object through which use or consumption presupposes a certain amount of embodied cultural capital. Artworks are a good example of objectified cultural capital in that their possession or consumption expresses the possessor or consumer's cultural knowledge of and disposition toward art. Bourdieu distinguishes ownership of artworks among the most valuable forms of objectified capital. Institutionalized cultural capital takes the form of qualifications or credentials such as school diplomas or university degrees. It takes on an objective value. In this way, institutionalization performs a function for cultural capital analogous to the function which money performs for economic capital. Put simply, cultural capital can be seen as an index of one's culture. There are many other forms of immaterial capital, but in the interest of keeping this video brief, I will restrict myself to explaining one more: attention. Attention has come to be understood as capital, and business and professionals are creating tools and techniques to help generate and exchange it. For artists, attention, if acquired in the right way and if handled correctly, can be converted to prestige. As I explained, symbolic capital is a form other forms of capital take when legitimated. In the field of contemporary Western art, galleries, art fairs, educational institutions, art critics, museums, and even mass media serve to legitimize symbolic capital. They function as cultural gatekeepers, whom society recognizes as having the authority to consecrate what is prestigious. I explained that symbolic capital, or prestige, is acquired when other forms of capital are recognized, but that is not exactly true. Prestige is the form other forms of capital take when they are misrecognized, that is, when the ways in which this capital is possessed and accumulated is not recognized as arbitrary. This disguised arbitrariness of possession and accumulation occurred due to the fact that possession of prestige is usually relative to the possession of other forms of capital, primarily economic capital. Prestige is therefore misrecognized as essential to the individual and not as forms of capital which have been accumulated. This prestige, the legitimacy of an individual, is not seen for what it is, which is capital. Another key concept for an understanding of symbolic capital is field. The value of capital is relative to the field in which it is legitimated. Examples of field are the field of art, the field of science, the field of politics, and the field of academia. Fields interact with each other and are hierarchical. The operative capital in a field is a set of resources which can be used to gain advantage in it. Let me give you a quick example of the relation of field to capital and the way in which capital can be converted to symbolic capital. If I have a lot of contacts in the construction industry in Calcutta, this would constitute social capital for me. In the field of Western contemporary art, this social capital would be of little value and so would convert into relatively little symbolic capital. If, however, I have a lot of contacts in the museum circuit in New York, the social capital this would constitute would convert into relatively high symbolic capital. In my research, I have developed economic models which demonstrate how prestige is accumulated through artists' relationship to subject matter, participants, and institutions. These economic models are ideal types, and it is important to state that I am not intending to reduce the complexities of these relationships to exchanges of capital. Rather, I am locating economies of prestige embedded in these relationships. Let us first look at the artist-subject matter relationship. An economic model I have found to be prevalent in these relationships is one of extraction. This is a work of mine titled Financial Advice Bureau. The performance, highlighting the irrational distribution of trust between social groups in Irish society, took as its primary subject Anglo-Irish Bank. Anglo-Irish was the bank which more than any other precipitated the economic crash of the Irish economy. At the time of the performance, the bank, due to its criminal and scandalous practices, was on the front page of every newspaper in Ireland and many in Europe. Another good example of subject matter rich in attention capital is the work YSL by Mexican artist Artemio. The work highlights how political philosophies relate to patterns of consumption. Presuming a correlation between cultural disposition and patterns of consumption, this work speaks to an art world audience through particularly resonant symbols. If we examine the exchange of attention capital between parties in these two works, we see that it is controlled by one party and operates without the consent or against the will of the other. As such, the works can be seen to be extracting the attention capital the subjects possess and converting it to symbolic capital for the artist and artworks. Some other examples of this extractive economy embedded in an artist's relationship to subject matter are Shepard Fairey's Obama Hope poster and the Yes Men's Dow Chemicals project. Next, we look at free exchange economies embedded in artist relationships to participants. I use the term free exchange to define economies in which the forms of capital exchanged are of relatively equal value and in which parties operate independently. In a performance I did titled Awake for the Celtic Tiger, I used cultural symbols and rituals to articulate and explore elements of the cultural transition the Irish people underwent, from the beginning of the economic boom through to the recession. I mobilized the audience so that they would engage in a minute's silence, contribute to a series of eulogies, and follow a funeral march through Dublin City, in effect becoming performers for the greater public. I also acquired the participation of an author, an activist, and a trade union vice president to eulogize an effigy of the Celtic tiger. The presence and labor of these participants presented them as a resource of prestige. I exchanged symbolic capital with the eulogists as the work echoes their political sentiments and as our fields are related. With the public participants, I exchanged cultural for attention capital, which I then objectified through documentation. Given the immaterial nature of attention, cultural, and symbolic capital, it is very difficult to quantify the value of the capitals exchanged, but we can demonstrate their relative equality with simple thought experiments. If I had asked the eulogist to spend 8 hours reading a carefully prepared speech, I doubt they would have accepted without question. However, if the performance was to represent Ireland at a world-renowned biennial, which would be televised internationally, such a demand may have seemed acceptable. As for the participants, if I had asked them to march behind the procession for 4 hours through Dublin, I am sure most, if not all, would have refused to do so. However, if the procession had been led by Banksy and was protected by state security and enveloped by intense media coverage, I am sure such a demand would not have been so readily refused. What this demonstrates is that people are intuitively aware of the economies of immaterial capital in which they engage. As such, it shows how both parties operated independently according to an equal distribution of power and equal exchange of capital. Another example from my research is Spencer Tunick's Ireland 6, in which 2,500 participants lay naked along Dublin's south wall for him to document. Although some may have just liked the idea of being naked, many were largely motivated by the resource of cultural capital participation presented, although it is highly unlikely they would have thought of it in those terms. Tunick's relatively high symbolic capital offered the participants a much greater resource, and as such he could demand more in exchange. Again, we see that participants were intuitively aware of the capital exchanged, operated independently, and to relatively mutual gain. The final ideal type we will look at is patron-client economies embedded in artist relationship to institutions. Patron-client economies are characterized as economies in which the value of capital exchanged is different. The exchange of capital is solicited but not equally controlled by both parties, and in which the power relationship corresponds to conditions of scarcity and abundance of capital. To demonstrate this, we will look at the relationship constituted through a work I am producing for the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. The work raises questions about the branding of artists, the embedding of artists in economies of symbolic capital, the structural role of institutions in these economies, and the relation of symbolic capital to economic capital. To avoid being misconstrued as reductive, I will reiterate there are many values exchanged in these relationships, but this study is focused on exchanges of symbolic capital. My participation with the Van Abbe Museum is based on my enrollment in the Dutch Art Institute. The selection process of the DAI acts as a proxy for the Van Abbe Museum's selection process. I function as a conduit for an exchange of social and symbolic capital between the Van Abbe Museum and the DAI. Prestige, especially of the value offered by the Van Abbe Museum, is a scarce resource for an emerging artist such as me. My artistic labor and the little prestige which it offers is an abundant resource for the Van Abbe Museum. There is also an inherent risk in this relationship, as the capital the museum stands to accumulate directly from me does not balance the possible loss of capital should the work be deemed unsuccessful by other gatekeepers. These conditions correspond to an unequal distribution of power in the relationship and an unequal control of the flow of capital in the exchange. As such, I characterize the economy embedded in our relationship as patron-client. The embedment of patron-client economies of prestige in the relationship between artist and institution is prevalent. Artists who are engaged in these economies often act as proxies or conduits for institutional exchanges. In conclusion, my research suggests that artists who better understand the ways in which these economies of prestige operate are at an advantage in the attainment of professional success. This is not to say that for artists to benefit from these economies, they must be aware of them in the ways and terms in which I have described them. Rather, I am saying that artists who, consciously or intuitively, strategically or naturally, adhere to the logic of these economic models will be more commercially, economically, or reputationally successful. What is also clear is that the prestige accumulated in these relationships is based on misrecognition of other forms of capital. The possession, exchange, and accumulation of prestige are disguised, making the possession of prestige appear as a direct byproduct of artistic ability and essential to the artist. Resultantly, what we see emerge are artworks that can be seen to have at least two distinct artistic values. The artistic value it is perceived to have based on misrecognition of the processes through which the artist accumulated prestige, and the artistic value it actually has. Given the cult of the author, which dominates commercial and cultural production, we are unlikely to encounter many instances in which the latter is readily interpretable. What does all this mean for artists today? Are we to imagine ourselves as brands scrambling for attention and recognition? Cogs in a machine of valorization waiting for our turn? As businesses of one, selling ourselves in every social instance to the best of our ability? Should we, as many internet tutorials suggest, dedicate 50% of our working day to self-promotion? I am very uncomfortable with seeing myself or my practice in these terms. I see this problem as a kind of duality in which neither component can ever be satisfied, a duality in which artists must protect their creative processes from the pervasive rationale of neoliberalism while sustaining some neoliberal processes, in order to realize their artistic prerogatives.